Like I created Vue initially as a sort of experiment. I didn't expect it to become a full-blown thing that can fully replace Vue CLI, but it did, right? So a lot of times it's like we experiment on ideas, and then if we find them good enough, we work on them more. And then when we realize it has potential, we start to coordinate across the ecosystem to see, okay, this has the potential to, say, replace the old thing.
Hey there, I'm Caleb Brown from X Team, and welcome to our Icon series. I recently had the pleasure of sitting down with Evan You, the creator of the open source JavaScript framework, Vue. The following is our discussion, consisting of questions from the X Team developer community. Enjoy. So Evan, thank you so much for joining us. It means a ton to me that you're here, and I know that our development community here at X Team is absolutely going to love this. And in fact, all of these questions are directly from our community. So without further ado, I'm just going to jump into the first one, which is simply, what problems did you set out to solve when you started writing Vue?
So when I started working on Vue, I was working at Google as a creative technologist, and the kind of projects we worked on were really experimental. They are kind of go fast as fast as possible, churn out a lot of prototypes, get the ideas into something tangible as fast as possible. So for a very long time, when I started learning JavaScript, right, I just learned HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Didn't really learn any frameworks. I tried a little bit of Backbone, but felt that it didn't really help me that much with the type of work that I do, because Backbone only gave you the structure. It didn't give you this sort of automatic binding between state and the view, right? And that was when a colleague of mine started using AngularJS, the version 1 in some of the projects. And I saw that and I was like, oh, okay, cool. So you can actually use the template syntax and get everything just to automatically update. So it got me curious, and I didn't actually bother looking into how Angular actually worked, because I felt, okay, this is something I can build myself. So in the very beginning, it was really twofold. One is I needed something that provides the similar reactive view updating features that Angular had, but I didn't want all the other baggages that came with Angular, which is a very monolithic framework. On the other hand, I wanted to just experiment and sort of use it as a hobby project to just, it's also a learn better JavaScript in some way.
Absolutely.
So that's really how it started.
Great, that makes sense. Good answer. And then I really like this this next question. It says, Vue.js is the favorite front-end framework among my Python friends. Why do you think Vue is so popular with back-end folks?
I think it's twofold, right? The first is Vue is not, in the beginning, Vue is designed to be, the term that we coined is the progressive framework. The idea is that the initial adoption, we want to make that barrier as low as possible, which means, like, when you start learning Vue, you don't need to, say, install like 200 modules of Node.js modules. You can just start in the browser. You can link Vue from a CDN or just as a single script, and then you can get something on your screen. So the initial point of integration with any backend framework can be as low barrier as possible, right? Literally, you just add a script tag and you can get Vue going on your page. I think that is very important because, for backend developers, they don't necessarily, like, especially for the type of apps you're building, right? When we talk about modern front end, we think about complex single page applications with rich interactions, but not all types of apps are really like that. For a lot of apps, backend developers, they are used to build apps that's mainly server focused. You render something on your page that's already coming from the server, and then you add lighter interactions on top of that. And I think Vue fits that use case really well. But at the same time, you can have the same knowledge that carries over when one day you say, okay, maybe this should be an SPA. So I'll do an SPA and Vue can do that too. Right? So I think this is where the progressive framework concept really kind of plays well with people coming from backend frameworks.
Very cool. And then moving on, I did want to kind of focus on Vue 3, which brings us here. But can you tell us some of your favorite features in Vue 3? Just one feature or a couple? And did you run into any interesting challenges you had to solve during its development?
Yeah, my favorite feature is probably script setup, which we shipped in 3.2.
Yep.
So the thing is, when we came up with composition API, I knew that it had potential, but one of the major pain points for users to sort of adopt it is they felt that it's like the initial impression for a lot of people is that it became more verbose compared to Options API. But script setup really kind of turns that whole conversation around. Because now with script setup, a lot of people start to think, okay, like composition API with script setup is actually cleaner or less verbose compared to Options API, and it gives you a bit more freedom and flexibility, right? So I think it really helped sort of changing the perception for a lot of people on composition API, which I think is great because it's kind of hard to push people past the initial hurdle if the first impression they get is, okay, I'm actually writing more code than I used to. And then once you get past that, you get to better appreciate like the other capabilities that composition API was supposed to give you. So I think script set really kind of achieved its job there.
Yeah.
I guess there's some interesting challenges, of course, when implementing it, but mostly it's about finding the right compile output. In fact, the compile output of script setup would be more efficient than the non-script setup equivalent because we were actually able to compile in a way that gets rid of the component instance proxy altogether. So everything is actually in the same function scope. So with script setup, every expression in your template that accesses something in your script actually is accessing it directly in the same function scope, instead of grabbing it over through a instance object. So that instance object, that property access actually has a cost. So script setup, the compile output actually gets rid of that cost.
So the next one that I have for you is, was there a specific feature that was in the design of Vue 3 that didn't make it to launch? And if so, can you tell us a little bit about the process of kind of separating out that planned feature from the core release?
Yeah, for example, like we actually had a branch that experimented with time slicing.
Okay.
So like the concurrent like feature, like in React, essentially allows you to split up the work of components, and then essentially if you are stuck in CPU time for over a frame, we break it up a little bit. So we experimented with that, but turns out it adds so much complexity, but eventually the outcome that we tested in some real-world apps wasn't that impressive, the gain, because it's I wrote a long form response in one of the issues because one of the users actually asked, like, why did you remove it? Yeah. So I wrote a long response to it, and the gist of it is time slicing only helps with slicing up pure CPU work, that like pure computation in JavaScript. But it doesn't really help with the DOM operations because if you slice up the DOM operations, you risk your what we call tearing. So your state will be in an inconsistent state. Yeah. So all the DOM operations needs to be flushed synchronously. So that means if you have a really big update, the DOM is more likely to become the bottleneck, which time slicing really doesn't help with. And then we profiled the pure CPU time that we spent in Vue compared to, say, React. And we noticed that we already done a lot of work in the template compilation to try to optimize everything as much as possible. So although Vue uses virtual DOM underneath, the template compiled output is actually more optimized render function. It leaves a lot of compile time, analyze the hints, so that the runtime can take fast paths. So the runtime actually skips a lot of work because of the compilation step. And there are other aspects like composition API, because it's one shot compared to React hooks being multiple iterations. Yeah. Like React hooks requires a lot of hand tuning optimization, like use memo. You need to like pass the correct dependencies and all that stuff. Yep. Use callback. If you don't use callback, then your child components always updates. So and developers are lazy. They don't want to think about this all the time, right? That's a
Sure, of
reality.
course.
So
Yeah, absolutely.
so the result is most React apps, they actually over render by default. But Vue apps, because first of all, we have fine-grained reactivity. Second, we do compile time optimizations, which React doesn't really do. Although technically you can do some of them with
Right.
JSX. Their default transform is a like full reconciliation at runtime. So combined with these, we just see like Vue just doesn't spend as much as time in CPU in a typical application, and there's not much this sort of large cascading updates that spends a lot of time in CPU just trying to reconciliate the views. So in the end, we just conclude it's not worth it for Vue. The complexity and the eventual gain is just not a good trade-off. There are also other problems because we realize when you start to slice up work and you try to schedule them, it becomes possible to have this sort of tearing and re-entry issues, and the user is less sure about when their code actually runs. Where a view change, we flush, then everything is updated. This mental model is extremely straightforward. So especially when you're working with something that needs to do dirty work directly related to the DOM, this mental model actually simplifies things a lot. Where in the concurrent world, it becomes a lot more complicated.
The next one I have for you is, as Vue 3 started to become a bit more widely adopted, there seems to be a second generation of the ecosystem. Vite is superseding Vue CLI. Pinia is gaining traction as a more simple approach to state management compared to Vuex, things like that. So I'm just wondering what your kind of general opinion is on the Vue library ecosystem and tooling, and just kind of the way that it's evolving.
Overall, I think the way the Vue ecosystem works is we have a loosely decentralized but still somewhat coordinated approach to it. So first of all, each layer or piece of the framework, like the router or the state management or the build tooling, right? They have their own evolution tracks, like Eduardo will work on the router and Pinia. So a lot of work is done by the individual motivation from a team member. Like I created Vue initially as a sort of experiment. I didn't expect it to become a full-blown thing that can fully replace Vue CLI, but it did, right? So a lot of times it's like we experiment on ideas, and then if we find them good enough, we work on them more. And then when we realize it has potential, we start to coordinate across the ecosystem to see, okay, this has the potential to, say, replace the old thing, right? The upside of this is everybody gets more freedom. We don't really sort of set a deadline, say, okay, you need to come up with a new version of Vuex in the next 5 months, right? We don't do that. Usually when we see there's an opportunity, there's, okay, like, oh, one day we have an idea, then we start working on it, right? But once we have a bunch of these ideas going to a somewhat mature state, we start thinking about how they can play together, right? That's sort of part of my job of making sure the ecosystem stays coherent and give the message out to the community. Which is why, combined with the new docs launch, we completely refreshed the official recommendations. Right? So if you go to the quick start page now, the whole recommendation is the new set of tools. The getting started, it's Vue-based. We recommend Pinia over Vuex now. So we also recommend Volar, our new VS Code extension, over the old one, which is Viter. And I think these new options, they grew and they came about very organically. But when they eventually flourish, we try to put them together, and it becomes a new set of standard for Vue as a framework. So that's generally how we do it.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And that's interesting because admittedly, I didn't know too much about kind of the team dynamic. So it's interesting to kind of learn a bit about sort of how the team works together. So moving along, the next question I have for you is, it says there's a fairly large movement towards using just the included features of Vue 3 instead of third-party libraries now that we have the composition API. Do you think there's a better way forward? It says it seems that there's a trend among fairly large frameworks such as React with people ditching third-party libraries and using features provided by hooks and suspense. Do you think this is just the general direction of modern frameworks are moving in, or do you have a different opinion?
So to be honest, I'm not sure if there's such a trend. Like,
Okay,
I'm not sure if
interesting.
if this observation is correct in the first place.
Yeah.
I think the arrival of hooks and conversation API actually it's beneficial on both sides because it makes it easier for you to create your own abstractions inside your own own code base.
Yep.
Right. If you notice you're like doing the same thing in multiple places in your code base, it becomes very easy for you to abstract it into, say, hooks directory or a composable directory, and which then you can reuse all over your project. But at the same time, it also makes it easier for libraries to be written. And I think the benefit of this is Composition API and hooks makes reusability a first-class concept in the framework.
Yep.
Right? So the library that you're using are probably written in similar ways that you created your own composables. And you can turn your own composables into a library if you want to. So so I think in a lot of cases, it's not about rely on built-in or rely on external. It's really just the new mechanism, reusability mechanism, just makes it seamless for you to move either in or out of it. So if it makes sense to use a library, you can use a library because it's pretty much the same thing. It's just like import use X from either from a package or from your own directory, but the way you use it will be the same inside the components, right? So it's much better than, say, in the past, it's like everything inside your framework is written, inside your code base is written in one way, where every library comes with its own way of being integrated into your framework. So I think that's an improvement in general. Like for Vue, like we have the Vue use library, which is extremely useful. It just comes with so much useful utilities. So a lot of, I think Vue use is probably the best thing that's happened to Composition API.
Yeah.
So yeah, a lot of stuff you don't really want to write yourself over and over again.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. So I wanted to ask how you assess the impact of technologies like WebAssembly or even the already kind of controversial Web 3.0 on how we develop web interfaces. Do you see them positively impacting or changing the direction of the front-end framework evolution?
I think, so first of all, WebAssembly and Web3 are two completely different things.
They are, yes.
So I don't think Web3 has anything to do with front-end technologies.
Yep.
It's just the same.
Yep.
Web3 is really only about the decentralization of the data layer. So WebAssembly is interesting because the problem with WebAssembly is you can't compile pure JavaScript to WebAssembly, which means you need to write your source code in another language.
Right. Yep.
So that's one thing. The other thing is the deployment cost, the size of the binaries and the actual performance gain in real world scenarios. Like you have to gauge that in order to see whether it's worth it. Like personally, my opinion is WebAssembly is great at really computation intensive and well-defined tasks, like processing a video directly in the browser or compressing an image directly in the browser or computing some hash. I think these are good like use cases where a dedicated library written distributed as WebAssembly will provide really great performance. But writing your like application logic, especially on a fast iterating project, using a compiled language that compiles to WebAssembly, I just don't think it provides enough benefits compared to JavaScript, because in most cases, this is not really a bottleneck. Like the code you write in JavaScript in your application, it's very unlikely to be a real bottleneck in the first place. Like if you have really computation intensive, like replace it with a library that's in WebAssembly, but write everything in WebAssembly, like personally, I don't think it's a good trade-off, especially considering, like say if you write Rust and compile to WebAssembly, then Rust is a very difficult language, and a lot of the business needs in the typical application is very fluid, in flux, right? You need to change things around a lot. Sometimes you need to do dirty things, and Rust really doesn't like you for doing that.
Absolutely.
So you're gonna find yourself pretty painful, and then there's the hiring aspect. It's hard to find competent Rust developers. It's much easier to find someone who's good at JavaScript.
Absolutely.
So there are multiple aspects you need to consider. So personally, I don't think WebAssembly is going to become like, say, we're going to write full applications with a WebAssembly, but there are going to be a lot of these well-defined computation-intensive tasks. Slowly, we see WebAssembly distributed implementation becoming, say, the go-to choice for a lot of people. So that's very possible.
Thank you for that. And then I really love this question. Again, all of these are from our community. Have you had any out-of-the-box ideas for Vue 3 development which you simply couldn't implement due to limitations of things like the browser itself, perhaps JavaScript, or even just CSS specifications, anything like that?
Yeah, so the thing is with front-end frameworks, we essentially always, we're kind of dancing with shackles.
Sure.
From basically the initial design stage is like, what can we do today? And like, say, in the early days of Vue, like we decided to not support IE8, and that was controversial back then.
Back then, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So the thing about framework development is you're always working on, like, according to the lowest denominator of all the browsers you want to support. So we are like, as a framework designer, I'm always kind of really conservative and defensive on the features that I leverage. Because you want to make sure the framework is as compatible as possible, right? Like, if you want to go completely wild, I just think, like, there should be efficient ways for us to update the DOM without having to write all these diff algorithms or like awkward compiled outputs ourselves.
Right.
Like there should be a declarative way of just updating the DOM that's built into the browsers. But I don't know, like maybe someone's working on it.
Sure.
There were like the template proposals and all that stuff, but it just never went through. CSS, I think CSS is going in some interesting directions. Like pairing container queries, I think is huge. And natural scoping, like there was a proposal that's related to non-shadow DOM based style scoping, which was really good. I wish we have that so that we can like basically completely drop the custom scope CSS implementation in Vue and just use that. Basically, I would be happy if the browser just provided things that we can no longer hack around ourselves.
Absolutely. Cool. That makes sense. And again, I want to be super respectful of your time. I only have a couple more for you. And actually, this is the last one that's sort of technical. And then we'll wrap up with a couple of non-tech questions, if that's cool. But our last technical question I have for you is, do you see Vue expanding to be cross-platform? And how can Vue 3 help with cross-platform apps, whether that be mobile to desktop, rendering to canvas, things like that? So
first of all, Vue already has a custom render API, so you can technically build your own rendering to canvas. There is a project called Trios.js that uses Vue syntax but renders to WebGL, so 3D stuff. And then Eduardo, who's on our team, recently just open sourced the project called, I forgot its name, but it's using Vue to build terminal UI.
That's interesting. Okay.
Right. So it's also using the custom render stuff. So Vue core itself is architectured in a way to be platform agnostic. The DOM-facing part is a higher order runtime that's based on the core runtime. So you can build other runtimes targeting other ones using the API, which is documented. But that's technical stuff, right? If you want a truly cross-platform native development, the major chunk of work is actually implementing a rendering engine that like behaves the same on both iOS and Android, and that's a huge amount of work. Like,
for sure.
You know how the React Native teams hires, I don't know, like a couple dozen of developers, full-time Facebook engineers just to work on the native rendering part. Flutter team probably has even more people. Right. So so as an independent open source project, our focus is still on the web, but we do architecture the core to be platform agnostic. So if any third party with the resource and interest want to work on a cross-platform thing based on Vue, that's possible, but we just don't have the bandwidth to actually do something like that.
Mhm.
Some ideas could be, connecting the Laravel Flutter engine with a Vue custom runtime.
Yep.
It's totally possible. But obviously, like for us, we don't really have the bandwidth to do that.
Yeah, and like I said, we can move on to some of the non-technical questions. I think folks in our community were kind of looking at your website, which gives you a little bit of a hint into kind of who you are as a person, what you dig. But the first question I have for you is, do you have any favorite artists or even a genre of music that you like to listen to while writing code? I know that things like chill hip hop beats to study and relax to are popular with developers. But yeah, just kind of curious if there's any music you dig, particularly during development.
Yeah, I kind of like. I do sometimes listen to lo-fi hip hop stations, and then there's I also like jazz piano.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
When I'm coding, because something less lyrical. Because if there's lyrics, I start to listen to the lyrics and like distract myself.
Yep.
So something pure melodical is great. And I also have, I listen to a lot of Chinese hip hop, which is probably lesser known in the West. But the more melodic rap, which is more like, I don't know, there's a close equivalent. It's hard to describe, but like, it's kind of like between R&B and rap, but a bit more melodical. Yeah.
Awesome. That's very cool. Very cool. Nice. Thank you. And then, the last one I have for you here, it says your website. Yeah, this does come directly from your website. It says your website enjoys playing video games. Are there any games you're playing right now that you're in love with? Anything that you're looking forward to, or perhaps you're just a little too busy to be playing video games?
I actually spent a couple weeks just playing Elden Ring.
Nice.
When it came out.
Nice.
Yeah. So I beat the game twice.
Oh, that's awesome. Nice.
Yeah. So I'm a very long time like Souls fan. So I played like Dark Souls 3, Bloodborne. I didn't finish Sekiro. I don't know, like that time when Sekiro came out, I was really busy and I played it for a bit and died like 20 times on a boss and I just gave up and rage quit.
It happens.
But I do enjoy a lot of the From Software games. Yeah.
Very cool. And then, so sorry, I want to wrap up here, but I thought of something that I wanted to ask you before we kind of wrap up, and I didn't email it to you, but I was just curious if there's and it can be as general or specialized as you wish, but any just kind of advice for folks kind of breaking into software development, whether they're getting out of high school or they're getting out of college or even just changing careers. I was just curious if you had any. You're obviously very involved in the the open source world. If that's a good place for folks to start, just wanted to hear any advice, any tips, any kind of mentoring that you had for folks kind of jumping into it.
Personally, for me, I believe you need to at least find some natural passion for the thing you want to do. If you treat tech as a job, if you treat anything as just a job, you'll probably find it miserable. Right? So the important thing is you want to at least try to find an area in programming in general, in tech in general, that gives you fulfillment when you be able to figure something out or build something. Like I think you need to enjoy like building things with code. That if you can have that mindset, then it just will naturally drive you to grow. Because I know it's really like I find it's really hard to sort of force myself to do things I'm not generally interested in. So I don't know if this sort of like enjoying building stuff, this kind of mindset can be cultivated. But if not, I think it's going to be tough to grow beyond just entry level. In order to advance in the career, in the tech career, you need to be able to find something that drives you to be constantly learning. That's basically I think what kind of helped me along the way.
For sure. No, absolutely. I mean, same when I was kind of getting into it was that I wanted things to exist that didn't exist. And so that's why I picked up PHP back in the day, because it was a fast language to start building stuff that I wanted to see in the world. And then, went on from there. So you're right.
Yeah, I guess on that, another tip I would think is don't think too much about like what is the right tech to bet on, because like to be honest, like once you master one initial thing, Like in the category, say you master a language, then learning the second language will be probably like 2 to 3 times easier compared to the first one, right? So it's not like you pick the first language you pick is a wrong language, then you waste all that time. It's not wasted, because learning a language itself is a process of understanding like what a language really is. So that actually sets just makes you more efficient when you try to learn the next language. So it's not completely wasted time. So I think a lot of people, when they're just getting started, they worry too much about what if I pick the wrong thing. The thing is, you can always learn more than one thing. So
well, Evan, thank you so much. Like I said, it means a ton to me that you were able to jump on a call and chat with us for a bit. And I know the X Team community is really going to love this. You're giving me cool points just for being able to chat with you. So again, I really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Great questions.
Good. Glad to hear it.